In the interest of time, let me hand over to His Excellency Mr. Asim Iftikhar Ahmed, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary and Permanent Representative of ESCAP. Mr. Ahmed, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Madam Executive Secretary, Excellencies, Ministers, distinguished participants, I would like to welcome you all to this high-level event on debt relief in the aftermath of the pandemic that Pakistan is pleased to organize in collaboration with ESCAP during the 77th session. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, has caused immense human suffering across the globe and has triggered the worst economic and social crisis in generations. The economic shock has been particularly severe on the developing countries. It has impacted fiscal space and liquidity and exacerbated the debt problem. In view of the gravity of the situation, world leaders have advocated urgent action. Last April, for example, Prime Minister Imran Khan proposed a global initiative on debt relief. G20 have come up with the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. The UN and the Secretary General have championed consistently the cause of the developing countries facing debt difficulties. Debt suspension by the G20 and emergency lending programs of the IFIs and others have provided some breathing space, which is very welcome. But according to estimates, the developing countries need well over $4 trillion to recover from the pandemic and achieve the SDGs. The continuing pandemic, slow recovery, and limited fiscal space may further aggravate the debt crisis, which will hamper the Build Back Better objective and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Therefore, more decisive, comprehensive, and inclusive action is required to stave off the crisis. Also crucial is fresh concessional financing, especially for the LDCs and SIDS. It is time for global solidarity. Towards this end, it is important that the international community strengthens inclusive dialogues and mechanisms on sovereign debt. This event today brings to Asia and the Pacific the global discussions on debt facilitated by the UN. We have the ECOSOC President sharing key messages from the 2021 ECOSOC Forum on FFD. We will have perspectives on debt management from ministers and policymakers of member states. Also in focus will be the suitability of current global mechanisms to provide debt standstills and relief and how they can be improved. To set the ball rolling, let me now invite Her Excellency Madame Armida Salcia Alicia Bana, Executive Secretary of ESCAP, for opening remarks. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much, Excellency Ambassador Iftikhar Ahmed. Excellency Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this high-level side event on debt relief in the aftermath of the pandemic convened by the government of Pakistan. I'm very thankful to the President of ECOSOC, His Excellency Mr. Munir Akram, for kindly accepting my invitation to provide his opening remarks here today. COVID-19 pandemic is a truly unprecedented shock that caused severe economic contraction, substantial job losses, and considerable increase in poverty. It has also made the pursuit of SDGs much more challenging. In response, governments have rolled out significant fiscal packages, but their fiscal positions deteriorated and debt levels rose significantly. As such, sustaining policy support in the near term will not be easy. The global community responded through increased financing by the International Financial Institution and the Debt Services Suspension Initiative of the G20. The recent announcement of a new general allocation of the equivalent to $650 billion in SDR by IMF is also an encouraging development. However, given the enormity of the task at hand, these measures may not be sufficient. Further and continuous support will be needed and it is hoped that the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatments will provide an appropriate platform for future debt restructurings. Excellencies, the United Nations Secretary General recent policy brief on debt and liquidity provides additional ideas to address debt issues in developing countries, including on how to improve the international debt architecture. The recently concluded ECOSOC Forum on Financing for Development called upon the international community to strengthen inclusive dialogue and mechanism on sovereign debt issues. In this global context, the purpose of this side event is to discuss the debt situation in Asia and the Pacific. We would be very interested to know the views of the speakers on the suitability of current mechanism to provide debt relief. I look forward to hearing your suggestion on ESCAP's potential role as a regional platform for exchanges of views and collaboration on debt-related issues. Very much look forward to the outcome of this side event. I wish you a very productive session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibu Abida, for your opening remarks. We are very privileged to have a recorded message from Ambassador Munir Akram, the President of ECOSOC. I would request my colleagues now to play the message, please. May I ask the ESCAP Secretariat colleagues to please play the recorded message? The volume is not there. Can you start again?
Of ESCAP, ambassadors of Fiji and Pakistan, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this important event. The pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing debt vulnerabilities and exposed fragilities in the global financial architecture. According to the International Monetary Fund, 56% of countries are in debt crisis, debt distress, or face severe debt unsustainability. 6 developing countries have defaulted on their debt. Others may be obliged to do so. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my Prime Minister called for a global debt initiative last April. G20's debt suspension has provided some fiscal space to a number of low-income countries, including Pakistan. But the relief for the 44 countries which have applied is only about $5.5 billion. Nevertheless, we are glad that the G20 has agreed to extend the suspension till the end of this year. After deliberations which started last May on debt in New York, the ministerial declaration adopted at the conclusion of the Financing for Development Forum earlier this month has indicated some convergence on debt relief, sustainability, and liquidity issues in the aftermath of the pandemic. The G20's framework can be elaborated, adopted globally, and utilized to promote a deeper, long-term, and sustainable debt restructuring program that is responsive to the needs of individual countries. Greater use can be made of state contingent debt instruments, debt buyouts, debt swaps for climate, health, and SDG actions. Ladies and gentlemen, 80% of the debt of the middle-income countries is owed to private creditors. Their participation is missing in the debt suspension initiative so far. Apparently, the fear of credit downgrades and the problem of holdout creditors and vulture funds are obstacles to private sector participation. National and international measures need to be adopted to incentivize the private sector, and the creation of a public rating agency has been proposed to address the fear of downgrades. Excellencies, obviously much more needs to be done to support economic recovery in the developing countries and to prevent a debt and liquidity crisis in a number of developing countries. The proposed creation of $650 billion in new SDRs and the proposed voluntary reallocation of unused SDRs will significantly enlarge the capacity of the IMF and multilateral development banks to provide much larger net inflows to developing countries. The World Bank's IDA window should be at least doubled from the currently envisaged $30 billion to $60 billion. ODA commitments, of course, must be fulfilled. The multilateral development banks should also significantly scale up financing by extending maturities, providing concessional financing for all developing countries, and expanding their non-concessional lending windows. Some of the new proposals for innovative financing deserve close consideration. Costa Rica and ECLAC have proposed the creation of FACE, a concessional financing fund to recover from COVID. And the Economic Commission for Africa has proposed the creation of a liquidity and sustainability facility to mobilize low-interest loans for developing countries which have market access. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our deliberations on the debt issue began in May last when Pakistan convened the first informal consultations at the UN. A large menu of options have been identified and consensus has been reached on several policy actions. ESCAP, which represents the most dynamic region in the developing world, is well placed to lead the way in addressing the global and regional challenge posed by the debt overhang and the growing and enormous liquidity needs of the ESCAP region to recover from the COVID crisis and come back on track to the implementation of the SDGs by 2030. I thank you.
With these remarks from Ambassador Mr. Munir Akram, concludes our opening segment of the event. Let's move to the main part. We are honored to have been joined by distinguished panelists. Let me introduce them one by one. We are joined by His Excellency Mr. Shaukat Fayaz Ahmed Tareen, Minister of Finance and Revenue, Government of Pakistan. His Excellency Mr. Ibrahim Amir, Minister for Finance, Republic of Maldives. Mr. Mandul Nayaman Delag, Director General of Financial Policy Department, Ministry of Finance, Mongolia. Mr. Ruslan Tetikov, Head of Public Debt Department, Ministry of Economy and Finance, the Kyrgyz Republic, and Ms. Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Economist, Asia Pacific Corporate and Investment Banking, Natixis. Welcome everyone, His Excellencies. Before we begin the proceedings, let me make a few housekeeping announcements. As you all know, this session is recorded, so it can be archived and made available on ESCAP website after the event. So the participants can ask their questions in the comment box, and we'll be towards the end of the session, we'll be take them on in the last segment of the event. One more thing, the overall event is divided in two parts. In the first part, we will two segments, you can say. The first part we'll focus on country level experiences in managing the rising debt during the COVID pandemic in the last year, and what is the near-term outlook for the events. The second part will actually try to look forward, essentially what more measures are needed, what initiatives need to be undertaken, and how's the outlook looking in terms of solutions and in terms of challenges faced by the governments. So let me start with the first segment, and I have the honor to invite His Excellency Mr. Shaukat Fayaz Ahmed Tareen. Excellency, like many developing countries, Pakistan faces a difficult situation in managing its fiscal and debt position in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the other hand, the pandemic calls for additional fiscal spending on people and businesses. And at the same time, the revenue generation has slowed due to constrained economic activities and lockdowns. Please share with us how is your country managing the situation and what kind of debt management strategies has your government deployed? How do you see the debt outlook for Pakistan in the near term? The floor is yours, Mr. Tareen.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In run-up to the outbreak of COVID-19, Pakistan was already suffering from macroeconomic instability as it entered in an IMF program in July 2019. So we were on a stabilization path that called for significant fiscal and external account adjustments, leading to a general slump in the economy that led to high inflation, particularly in food prices. The population was therefore toiling under a tough stabilization program. The COVID-19 shock resulted in a major upheaval in the economy, as the country had to face widespread disruption due to lockdowns. Given the circumstances, we had no fiscal space to meet the contingencies of relief against loss of livelihood and compensation for major economic losses. The IMF program had to be suspended for nearly a year, while a relief package of rupees 1.2 trillion, which is equivalent to $8 billion, slightly less than 3% of our GDP, was formulated and implemented over a 2-year period. The most significant part of the program was emergency cash transfer totaling around 0.5% of GDP, whereby we reached out to 16 million families, some 46% of our population, which could well be the largest such program within the span of a couple of months. Now, IMF helped us through the rapid financing facility of $1.4 billion, and the G20's help of postponing some of the falling debt repayment maturity was quite timely. But soon we were called to resume the program with all the rigors, while we are hit again by a much worse third wave of COVID-19 pandemic. In the intervening period, our economy has responded well, and prospects of growth revival are quite visible as all sectors of the economy, agriculture, industry, and services sectors are showing significant positivity. Under the circumstances, we are struggling to face the competing demands of fiscal consolidation to remain in the program and meeting the ever-rising demands of the economic stimulus to support the economy and provision for relief for the vulnerable groups against the continuing adversities of corona pandemic. In 21 and 22, our external debt obligations are estimated at around 10% of our GDP, with moderate needs of fresh inflows to remain fiscally prudent. For Pakistan, the need for debt relief is both pressing and immediate. From this August forum, I would urge the developed world to use the occasion to show more generosity to help countries like Pakistan mobilize the requisite resources to fight the pandemic and support an economy showing strong signs of nascent recovery, despite the vagaries it suffered during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tareen. Before we move on, let me take this opportunity actually to have a basic virtual photo op. So if I can request all the panelists and speakers to turn their cameras on, and we can quickly have a virtual photo taken for all the panelists and speakers. Secretariat, please go ahead and let us know when you're taken the picture. Is it done? Can anybody confirm? Okay, I'm assuming it is done. Thank you very much, Excellencies and participants. Let's moving along with our discussion. Let me now invite Mr. Ibrahim Amir for his remarks. Excellency, the COVID-19 pandemic has hit the Maldives economy very hard due to the collapse of the travel and tourism industry. How is your government managing the fiscal position, especially the refinancing of the external debt in such a difficult context? Please share with us the support provided by multilateral development banks, the debt service suspension initiative, and other official bilateral creditors. And what are the main challenges that Maldives is likely to face in managing its debt in 2021 and 2022? Over to you, Mr. Amir.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Ramadan Kareem. As you know, with COVID-19 pandemic, the Maldives detected its first case on 7th March 2020, and with the first community transmission confirmed, the government declared a state of emergency on 12th March 2020, and we decided to close its borders from 27th March to 15th July 2020. This is the first time the tourism sector had been shut down ever since starting its operations in the 1970s. Other sectors such as the construction, trade, transport, and communication had also been affected due to the lockdown. The borders had reopened with the controlled measures which had resulted in notable increases in tourist arrivals while containing the spread of the COVID-19. We opened our international borders on July 15, 2020. Since the main income to the country was from tourism, with the borders closed, the government of Maldives brought in significant changes to the budget while reprioritizing for immediate COVID-19 related expenditures. The government reduced 2020 budget by over $600 million. However, revenue fall from pre-COVID estimates was over $960 million. Thus, the financing gap has increased significantly as well. USD $162 million economic recovery plan had been introduced to support businesses and individuals in March 2020, which included income support allowances, loan schemes, debt moratoriums, discounts on utility services to individuals, households, loan schemes and debt moratoriums to business enterprises, and further injection to the economy through frontline allowances to frontline health workers, and also healthcare spending and continued projects funded by donors. The government had successfully secured a total of $1.34 billion in 2020, out of which around $464 million was for COVID-19 support and others for the government development projects as loans and grants. This includes support from our major MDBs such as World Bank, ADB, IFAD, IDB, OFID, EIB, and also our bilateral partners such as India, Japan, China, and also USAID. The government had put in all efforts to secure maximum concessional financing to reduce the debt burden and address the debt sustainability issues that may arise in future due to the high cost of financing. As such, during the pandemic, following the downgrade of the country by the rating agencies, which is Fitch, the government 5-year conventional bond issued in 2017 had a significant decline in its pricing and had to reached close to 70% during its lowest. However, to mitigate and improve its pricing, the government had regular investor calls to ensure that investors are well informed of the country's situation and to explain the situation on the ground, which was different from what had been published by the rating agencies. GDP estimated to decline by 29% for 2020 and improve by over 20% in this year, 2021. We expect to reach pre-COVID levels by the end of 2021 and early 2022. As advised by experts and investors the government had also conducted a liquidity management exercise alongside its first sukuk issuance this year. And we have now successfully raised around $300 million together with a tender offer of any and all, which had resulted in a tender of 76% of the current bondholders. As a result, the government has been able to reduce its refinancing risk for the next year significantly by extending the maturity of this debt through the sukuk by additional 5 years. The government had faced and anticipates the following challenges in raising finance for the next few years due to the following. First, MDB country allocations significantly low compared to the government requirements for development, and bilateral friendly nations are also hard hit with the pandemic and might not be able to assist as required. Access to limited concessional financing is there. Due to the current country ratings, significantly higher cost of borrowing offered by creditors. And the other point is that World Bank Sustainable Development Financing Policy puts zero limit on non-concessional borrowing, a challenge for the government to obtain any financing with a grant element of less than 35%, especially during this pandemic, plus certain restrictions on the lender's side due to the internal policies related to this policy. Lastly, international debt capital markets might not be as conducive and uncertain due to the pandemic. When we look at the DSSI, the government requested for participation in the DSSI for 2020 and also the extension till June 2021. We received this from the official bilateral creditors, and the amounts differed significantly low compared to the financing requirement from the government side. It is deferred at NPV and to be repaid in 5 years after a 1-year grace period, and a significant hit on debt servicing through the economy has not reached pre-COVID levels. So the government is working on new financing methods as such, issued our debut international sukuk, and also working on innovative mechanisms such as green, blue loans to financing its deficit development and development projects. The government is also focusing on investments in non-tourism projects such as in the agriculture, fisheries, telecommunication, renewable energy as part of our diversification. So I hope I answer your questions.
Indeed, Mr. Hamid, thank you very much for a very comprehensive response. Let's move along to our next speaker, Mr. Mandul Neamandalag. He's the Director General of Financial Policy Department, Ministry of Finance, Mongolia. Mr. Neamandalag, according to the UNCTAD data, the foreign direct investment flows dropped significantly in 2020. As a major destination of FDI, especially in the mining sector, how has the pandemic affected your country's capital flows and what measures were needed to refinance the external debt? Also, according to the World Bank data, close to 40% of your country's sovereign debt services in 2020 were due to private bondholders. And this proportion will be even higher in 2021 and 2022. How has been your country's experience borrowing in the sovereign debt market in these circumstances? The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Malik. In 2020, Mongolia recorded balance of payments surplus amounting to US $787 million, where current account had a deficit equivalent to 4.4% of GDP, and capital account surplus was equal to 10.6% of GDP. The major driver to the current account deficit was a COVID-related economic slowdown in the service sector. However, the help of capital transfers from donor countries and partner international organizations, such as rapid financing instrument from the IMF, have helped us to bolster significant foreign direct investment inflows. At the same time, the current transfer has increased by 86% in 2020. As a result, the foreign exchange reserve has peaked at its historical highest level, amounting to 4.5 billion USD, which was equivalent to 34.5% of GDP, which is 10 months imports need. It is true that Mongolia has faced with the private sector repayments outweighing its disbursement because of commercial bank bond repayment of 500 million USD in 2020. Another reason for the large amount of external debt services was the buyback operation made back in October 2020 to refinance total of 600 million USD bonds due in 21 and 22. Accordingly, the government has mitigated the refinancing risks in the coming 2 years. Moreover, during the economic hardship, Mongolia has successfully paid 200 million USD repayments from budget revenue sources. Still 800 million USD bond repayment will be due in December 2020. In addition, Mongolia has further outstanding external debt obligations, including borrowings from international financial institutions and bilateral creditors, such as World Bank and the ADB. With the prudent debt management operations and fiscal discipline since 2016, we successfully resolved recent large repayments and increased investor confidence. Government is monitoring international capital market on a continuous basis and planning to conduct similar liability management operations, targeting 2020 and 23 bond maturities in line with the government debt management strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neamandalag. Let's move along to our next speaker, Mr. Ruslan Tetikov. He is the head of the Public Debt Department, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economy and Finance, Kyrgyz Republic. Mr. Tetikov, according to the World Bank data, about 50% of your country's debt services in 2020 were due to official bilateral creditors. However, Kyrgyzstan did not participate in the debt services suspension initiative of the G20. We'll be curious to know what are the main reasons for this decision. Were the benefits of this initiative insufficient, or it was not necessary for your country to participate due to access to other sources of refinancing? Over to you, Mr. Tetikov. Kindly unmute, please.
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Good day, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank for the government of the Pakistan and Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific Secretariat for organizing such kind of event in charge of debt management. Honestly, it's very important issues for us too, because World Bank and other specialist experts asked me too why we decided to withdraw the DSSI. This very interesting, not for the World Bank, in my opinion, for other countries too. Yeah. In 2020, due to the deterioration of the epidemiological situation both around the world and in the Kyrgyz Republic, caused by the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, as a result of a sharp decline in the country's economy and large losses in the losses part of the Republican budget, Minister of Finance, finance ministers and central bank governors of the G20 countries adopted a communique, memorandum of understanding on April 15, 2020, which sets out the terms of debt service suspension initiative for the poorest countries, including the Kyrgyz Republic. Kyrgyz Republic joined this initiative too. We signed this memorandum of understanding in 16th of June. But it was supposed to differ this sum for the second half of 2020, about 50 million of US dollars for the next 4 years. However, due to the fact that during negotiation with some creditors, it was not possible to reach agreement about for example, about agreement with some of countries regarding the financial conditions for the application of interest rate for the amount of the deferral granted. Moreover, we in our country in October 5th of 2020, we have some political events in the Kyrgyz Republic. The president of the Kyrgyz Republic was retired. Besides, the government of the Kyrgyz Republic was changed, and it should be noted that one of the main principles of the policy of the current government of the Kyrgyz Republic is aimed at fulfilling all its obligations to its bilateral and multilateral donors. In this sense, the Minister of Finance of the Kyrgyz Republic decided to withdraw the DSSI requirements. Moreover, we have another factors behind the withdrawal of the DSSI initiative by the Kyrgyz Republic was the application by some creditors the interest rate for the total amount of deferral. I mean about principal plus interest. The application of the interest rate on the total amount of the deferral, despite the fact that these funds will be released in the current period, will lead to an additional burden on the budget in the future, at a time when the state will be extremely difficult to recover from the consequences of the pandemic and other economic shocks. For example, for our debt, peak of the period of debt is from 2024 until 2033. That's why we decided to withdraw from DSSI. This is one of the main reasons. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Tetikov. Let's continue this thread of discussion a bit further, and I'll move on to the next speaker, Ms. Alicia Garcia Herrero. She's the Chief Economist, Asia Pacific Corporate and Investment Banking at Axis. So, Alicia, of the 24 countries eligible to the debt service suspension initiative in Asia and the Pacific, only 10, including Kyrgyzstan, decided to participate. What do you think are the reasons for this from your perspective? And also, why do you think private creditors have been reluctant to participate in such initiatives?
Thank you very much. First, I hope you hear me well. It's a pleasure to share this time with you. I would like to use a research piece that we published at Bruegel, Brussels-based European think tank, on this topic. Literally, what is holding the DSSI initiative from being successful? And I think there's a lot of issues, not all of which are easy to tackle, I have to say. This was done in a hurry in April 2020 in the midst of a pandemic. The intentions were, of course, the best. The problem was that there were many things to deal with. And the most important, in our opinion, was really the coordination of the creditors, because the creditor space has changed in the developing world, has changed dramatically in the past decade. And I think that is something that, in a way, the G20 only came to terms when the DSSI was designed. So if you allow me to basically go into the explanation why the coordination failure is the key issue behind the unsuccessful, in my opinion, given the needs and the amounts and the number of countries finally involved, here's a few thoughts. Well, first of all, the coverage in terms of what is to be, not voluntarily, but basically in a coordinated manner included. And this is, of course, public or publicly guaranteed obligations. The most obvious, by the way, by G20 or Paris Club members. This means there's no perfect kind of combination, because there's some G20 members that have become part of the DSSI, and the most notable one is China, but also India and Brazil. And then some Paris Club members who are not part of the G20 are also part of the DSSI. So there's already a little bit of a confusion on who are the creditors involved. But I would argue that beyond that, the definition of what is official versus what is private has been blurred, and that's part of the coordination issue. Beyond that, when we say official, and this is quite important, we are not including international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. So it's really only bilateral lending. And that's, by the way, a lot that we're missing, both because of the increasing importance of private creditors, but also, of course, multilateral organizations. The other thing, of course, is the definition of the countries that can apply. So the idea is this eligible low-income countries. But when you look at the actual space of countries hit by COVID, also with relatively low income, I mean, this is a much bigger space. So that's another kind of issue that we're not really dealing with. Every country that might need such treatment. And I'll go to the treatment in a minute. So just to give you a sense of dimension, the ELICs, the amounts covered, the debt by these ELICs that are indeed eligible is about 32 billion, but only 12 billion is eligible, given the definition that I just offered in terms of official lending. The other issue is how to apply. I mean, one could argue that this should have been the easiest, the better, given that it wasn't anyway a final solution to debt issues even in this group of countries. The reality is that it wasn't so easy. Yeah, the ELICs had to make a request to all of their official bilateral creditors, apply for IMF funding, agree on caps to new non-concessional debt. Well, this, thanks God, was relaxed later, and that's, of course, welcome. But I'm saying it isn't really an immediate thing that every country can attend. And I think it was already mentioned that if you happen to owe or have a bulk of debt with private investors, you really worry about what will be the impact of entering the SSI in terms of your rating and therefore on the cost of funding thereafter. Finally, and this is, I think the key point is that all of what I said would in a way be less cumbersome where the gain to be large enough. But the gain is really just a postponement of payments, which started really very, very, very short. So end of 2020, then we extended 6 months and 6 more months. It's what I call really kicking the can, because we all know that that's not going to be a final solution. So the extent of the coordination problem, plus the small amounts involved, plus the actual very, very limited debt relief in time, and certainly not in terms of net present value, makes it, in my opinion, complex. Just final second, if I may dwell a little bit more on the coordination issue, it is really about this new type of lender, both, of course, private, but also official, and the increasing role of China. So according to the World Bank, this is 63% of total official debt. And not being a member of the Paris Club, in a way, you have the largest lender with ideas, rightly so, that are different from existing official lenders. And I think that makes it extremely difficult, because the amount of transparency is just not the same, because a non-Paris Club member doesn't need to comply with OECD standards on that development assistance. And thus, the whole thing becomes increasingly complicated. I hope I have used my time efficiently, and I leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you. Very helpful, actually, laying out what kind of challenges, especially the coordination issues that have been faced, that have been hampering the efforts. Let's quickly move on to the second part of the segment. In this segment, I will ask the same question to all panelists, especially the country representatives. And if time permitting, we may go back to Alicia also for a technical question. But I want to primarily focus on the government representatives and the ministers. So the debt service suspension initiative that we have been discussing in the last couple of with the last couple of speakers, as we all know now, has been extended until end of 2021, end of December 2021. And at the same time, there's been an announcement that there will be a new allocation of IMF's special drawing rights that may provide additional foreign exchange reserves to all countries. At the same time, the G20 and Paris Club are encouraging countries with difficulties servicing their debts to utilize the new common framework for debt treatments beyond DSSI. So I want to know, what are your views from the perspective of your country on these latest developments? Do you consider the common framework as useful in providing debt relief in the near future? Which other solutions could be effective on the debt front to facilitate the recovery of your economy? And what kind of technical assistance or other international and regional platforms such as ESCAP can provide to help? So if I may request Mr. Abir, Honorable Minister Ibrahim Amir, to respond. Excellency, given the time constraint, if I may request you to limit your response in 2 minutes, around that time. Thank you. The floor is yours, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. As I mentioned earlier, the DSSI did not come with the most favorable terms to the sovereigns participating in it, though it gave us a temporary relief in the short run. And when we look at the common framework has its pros and cons, of which we think it is more with the negatives for the governments who participate in it. Number one, it is viewed negatively by rating agencies, and as you know, this will impact future borrowings of any government. For example, Fitch Ratings in February mentioned that this could lead to a sovereign default, and since the common framework requires creditors to reach and seek treatment from the private sector, it would impact the ratings negatively, as informed earlier, as there is a possibility of viewing this as a distressed debt exchange. And number two, it also requires an IMF program. The government itself, we are bringing in reforms, so we do not believe we need to enter an IMF program to implement or to go into a common framework. Plus, we have the possibility of losing market access, future market access. Number 3, countries entering the common framework are implying that it has an unsustainable debt situation that is only intended to tackle debt burdens that have been unmanageable from a liquidity or solvency perspective. And I believe we are not in that situation, and inshallah would not have to be in the future. Possibility of debt cancellation or relief is lower. Rather, there would be extensions, and this would overall cause a larger burden in the future. We think it might be better to negotiate bilaterally with creditors on mutually agreed terms rather than the common framework, and to renegotiate only on the problematic high-cost debt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Amir, this for very, very candid and clear suggestions and responses. May I now ask the same question to Mr. Mandul Niamandaleg from Mongolia, please. Kindly keep short response, very succinct.
Yep. Sure. Thank you, Mr. Ali Malik. So we were informed that Mongolia is eligible for this initiative on 22nd of April last year. However, we did not utilize this relief, partly because of the fear that it might reduce investor confidence about sovereign solvency and credit rating. You may be aware that of the total government foreign debt, about 30% is private sector debt. So we are very concerned about the sentiment of the private investors. Also, the calculated size to be relieved under this initiative was deemed insignificant. For market access countries like Mongolia, I believe that credit enhancement programs from IFIs, such as granting guarantees, could be beneficial to resolve refinancing risks for developing countries like Mongolia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Niamandaleg, for again very, very candid and direct insights. There's a lot of reluctance on the part of governments, it seems, for very legitimate reasons. May I ask Mr. Ruslan Tetikov to share his insights on the same question, same issue? The floor is yours, Mr. Tetikov.
Yeah, I would like to, for example, for the first year, what your views from the perspective of your country of these developments. Now it's very difficult to say something. You know, for example, it's we have the same situation, pandemic, 19 year. That's why it's very difficult to say something now. But about consider common framework useful or not, I don't know, because we don't join for these issues. That's why it depends on the country. And about the next question, which other solution could be effective on that front of facility recovery of your economy and the achievement of sustainable development? In my opinion, it will be very good. This is our regional, right? Our region who we can to talk with you, with other countries, and to maybe provide some initiative, not just for one country. It's needed to other countries. Well, for example, for maybe World Bank or maybe G20, because for example, for debt swap, environment for debt swap. Why we take these? I don't know. We join to Dssi because, you know, for example, the condition for this Dssi is a little bit difficult. Why? Poor country becomes poorest. Rich countries becomes richest. Why? Because, you know, for example, we capitalize not just principal, principal, but plus interest too. When we talk with bilateral creditors, we found this is not profitable for us. This is very important issues. I don't know why, because it's needed to talk with you, all of the countries, and because this is aid for poorest countries. Yeah, if for example they can help us, it's needed not to capitalize on interest. Just maybe some support for maybe principle. That would be perfect for us. This is like supporting of the developed countries for the developing countries. But we face another problems. Yeah. Yeah, this is my point of view. If, for example, you have another point of, because according to your title, for example, how can regional dialogue help? This is can help us together. If we talk about it, what if, for example, if we talk, for example, we won't able to pay for the developed countries, or maybe another, I mean about donors, for example, World Bank, IMF, and other donors. Yeah, what would be happen? Default all of the economies, right?
I hear you.
This is crisis of economy. But if, for example, developed countries can help us, it's needed to find another solution.
We hear you, Mr. Tetikov.
That is why I would like to talk with you and to talk about you, and I would like to know your opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tetikov. Your voice is, your opinion is absolutely clear and heard. This is the beginning of a regional dialogue. This is the first event of this nature with the countries involved here in the Asia Pacific, and this is the beginning, and we will be organizing more events to make sure the concerns of the countries and the governments are raised at the global platform as well. So thank you very much for your very candid views. The Finance Minister of Pakistan had to leave due to another commitment, but we have been joined by Mr. Awais Manzoor Sumra, the Additional Finance Secretary of the Government of Pakistan from Finance Ministry. So, Mr. Sumra, if you can hear us, would you like to pitch in, or you would like to hold your observations for the closing remarks? The floor is yours, Mr. Sumra.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Malik. Very briefly, I would like to say that this common framework for debt treatments, that has been very helpful to our country, and we have been able to reschedule about $4 billion through that. And in addition to that, we had a RFI from IMF of $1.4 billion. So all of that has combined to help easing the financial burden on Pakistan, which will beginning from May 2020 to the end of this year. Just one thing I would like to add here is that when this Dssi was being discussed, Pakistan had actually recommended that instead of rescheduling the debts, perhaps the affected countries could be given additional inflows equal to the amount which was being rescheduled. And the concept and rationale for that was that the rescheduling has a very negative connotation, as has been mentioned by many of the participants, honorable participants, also, as to the rescheduling has actually affected the credit ratings. It is viewed negatively by the credit ratings. So that was one suggestion by Pakistan at that time. But now that we have this framework, I must say that Pakistan has been able to ease the pressures on its financing. Looking forward, we would expect this common framework being a bilateral arrangement. We would expect the multilateral support in the form of fresh inflows or existing the rescheduling of existing debts as well. So moving beyond the bilaterals, we would expect some assistance at a multilateral as well. That's all I would like to add on this point at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sumra. Very, very clear. At least some positive experience by at least one member state over here. And that's the whole idea of this conversation and this regional dialogue, to give a platform to member states to raise their issues and suggestions going forward. I wanted to come back to Alicia. However, we are out of time. We have 2-3 more minutes, and we have about 10-12 questions. We won't be able to take all of them. However, I would like to take at least one of them, which sort of encompasses 2-3 different aspects of the kind of conversations we have had. Rest assured, those participants who have shared their questions, they have been noted, they will be incorporated in our future work and future conversations, and we'll pick up the thread from where we are starting this conversation. So let me ask this one question, and then an open question. Any of the panelists may jump in and share a response to that. The question is, the Secretary General of the United Nations proposed in a recent policy brief to launch a global forum for sovereign debt resolution and coordination to build consensus for new norms and standards for debt transparency and management, considering options on mediation and arbitration in debt restructuring. The question is, what is the views of the panelists on the UN setting up such a forum, and what role could ESCAP play at the regional level in Asia and the Pacific? So, anyone who wants to take the first jibe at it, please go ahead. You still want to collect your thoughts? Okay, maybe it requires time to give advice how UN should be going forward. I can try another question, slightly different one, and then we'll group the questions later and trying to include in the summary document that we'll be preparing and sharing with member states. So another question is asked by a friend from UNCDF, Paul Martin, and he's asking, what are the options for refinancing debt through capital markets in the region, and how credit rating agencies assist governments to manage and improve credit ratings to restructure debt through regular financial instruments? So that's the issue we touched upon in a few observations earlier, the inability of countries to go back to financial markets if they get debt relief. So it's on those lines because the credit rating might be adversely affected. Any panelist wants to respond to that one?
Yeah, Malik, I think two things can be done. It was suggested even in this discussion. One is we can have, because I think the rating agencies have been very cautious because of their experience in the financial crisis before. So looking at their experience, we can have a public rating agency, which has been suggested by other esteemed panel members. And also, if we are to access the debt capital markets and get funding at a relatively low cost, I think the multilaterals, World Bank, IMF, and other agencies also can. There can be a mechanism where guarantees can be given to these loans, so that we can access the debt capital markets at a lower cost.
Thank you, Mr. Amir. Any other panelists wants to add to those insights? I have 1 minute left in my watch here, so I can maybe quickly squeeze in a short question, which is slightly different, and then we'll move to the closing remarks. The question is, how can we best provide debt relief to middle-income countries that are not covered by DSSI and Common Framework? So the bulk of the conversation so far has been focused on those who are eligible for these initiatives, but what about some countries which are not directly eligible? Okay, I guess in the interest of time, what we'll do is we'll incorporate, as I said, all the question in the summary document that we'll prepare for this event and circulate to all member states, and then build on these kind of conversation, these kind of questions, so we can find more responses. As I said, this is one of the first dialogue of its nature we are holding in Asia and Pacific, and we intend to continue these dialogues in the near future. So before concluding, let me request Mr. Awais Manzoor Samra to deliver the closing remarks on behalf of the government of Pakistan. Mr. Samra, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Malik. I see we have already run out of time, so I will be very brief. It has been a pleasure to participate in this event today. And I would like to thank ESCAP and all the participants, all the honorable participants of this event for very useful insights into the challenges facing all our countries, all our regional countries as a result of this pandemic. We look forward to having a continued regional dialogue so as to learn from the experiences from all the countries. It has been very interesting to learn the experiences of the countries on the common framework, and we have a better idea of how the framework has had an effect on the countries and how it can be further improved and refined if required. So there's a need for all the countries in the region to continue with this dialogue and to come up with measures and suggestions to come out of the crisis as soon as possible. Pakistan itself is in the midst of the third wave of the pandemic. And as I have mentioned in my remarks, that we are looking for more multilateral help as well. And again, I would like to thank ESCAP and all the honorable participants for their very valuable insights and views and comments. And I look forward to further interaction with ESCAP and all our participants in future to learn more about this and to provide better policies for the future to get out of this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Samra, for these succinct and short remarks. Indeed, we will continue such efforts in the near future as well, and we'll be happy to engage with all the member states. This concludes our session. Thank you once again, Excellencies and distinguished panelists, for your contributions and time. I wish you a successful participation in the remainder of the Commission session. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.